Have you heard of the Satanic panic? In the 1980s, people were accusing nearly everything of being connected to the devil, famously including Dungeons & Dragons. D&D had a major cultural comeuppance since then, but you still get some people who think your D&D group is a cult. This is one of those stories. Shell, how dare you interrupt my video again? You're not advertising a revolutionary new campaign setting on my watch. I said silence. Be gone from my video. Back to the story. About 5 years ago, I graduated high school. I had been super into LARPing and had been for most of my high school career. My parents had always been super supportive of it, and my dad even going so far as to send pics of me fighting to family and friends. Well, after high school, I signed on to go on a mission trip to another country with my church that I went to at the time. Unfortunately, the bus got into a terrible accident on the way to the airport. I was in the hospital for a while, having several broken vertebrae, the sternum and left hip, as well as a myriad of other injuries. This is important because it ties into how much D&D meant, and still does, mean to me. I won't go into the details of how the recovery went and all of that, but to sum it up, lots of scars, long recovery time, back never recovered and developed a lot of new and long-lasting issues, and I am now in pain 24 hours a day and will be for the rest of my life. With all of that out of the way, I'm sure it's no surprise that I had to quit LARPing. I also could no longer work my old job at the grocery store, as lifting, bending over, standing for more than an hour, even sitting in most chairs for an hour all caused unbearable amounts of pain. What's more, my plans after high school was to go into the military, and they were now squashed. I ended up gaining a huge amount of weight because, well, it hurt to do almost anything. Needless to say that I fell into a pretty deep well of depression, and I won't go into the details, but let's just say it got dark. I stopped going to church completely, and I really don't consider myself a Christian at the moment. The only thing that brought me out of it was D&D. My experiences with D&D. I was lucky that after high school I kept my core group of friends and they were very supportive. If it hadn't been for them all wanting to try out D&D, this would have probably been a lot worse. We all fell head over heels for D&D and have been playing for the last 4 or 5 years. During this time, I fell down the rabbit hole of becoming a dice goblin. I loved dice and spent a lot of money over the years on all kinds of sets of dice. My friends knew this, and for Christmas and birthdays, they would usually get me more dice. Some of these friends I've grown apart with, that's just life, and the dice that they would get me were very sentimental because of this. I would also buy other D&D things like dice cages, wooden dice towers, dice bags, or wooden vaults, books, minis, and so much more. I even had a set of the D&D Anniversary Sapphire dice. Needless to say that all of this D&D stuff added up in value, probably around $2,000 to $3,000 in money spent. Family's view on D&D. I live in an old school Christian household, and so my parents at first were not so thrilled about me playing D&D, the whole satanic panic and whatnot. After I explained what we did and how it worked, they decided that they were fine with it, but I probably shouldn't talk about it with the grandparents. I would tell them the stories from time to time, my mom particularly enjoying them, and even started to, on birthdays and holidays, get me dice and other D&D gifts. D&D is a particularly empowering experience in that it is enjoyable by pretty much anyone. Rich, broke, online, IRL, but you can also enjoy it while injured. I learned that recently when I broke my arm and I couldn't game or edit my videos. I actually couldn't do much of anything, so D&D was pretty much the only thing I could continue doing normally. Anyways, don't be deceived by the seeming positivity of the story. The gift giving was the last good thing to ever happen here. It's about to get a lot worse. Roll post. So, around a couple months after COVID hit the US, I suddenly started getting sick. Mainly just stomach pain, nausea, and what usually comes with nausea. This got to a point where almost every day I was sick and I traveled with a bucket everywhere. Everything would set my stomach off. Food, touch, needing to use the bathroom, hell, lying in bed would make me sick. I ended up developing terrible anxiety with nausea, which ironically would usually make things worse. This went on for 9-ish months. My mother, bless her soul, helped me out wherever she could, sitting with me through anxiety attacks, getting meds, taking me to the doctors, everything. The horror story. So, during me being terribly sick and needing to be with someone who could help me when it got really bad, I ended up usually wherever my mom was. One week, my aunt and uncle, who normally watch my grandmother, went on vacation, and so my mother and myself stayed at their house to give her the 24-hour care that she needs. I couldn't help much because I was constantly sick and ended up either in bed or in the bathroom for most of the time. I think I got desperate, and so during a conversation with my parents, I talked about possibly going back to church. My dad was elated at hearing this. He had been trying to get me to pray and read the Bible to stop me from being sick. Well, a few days later, I was stuck in bed. He said that the church pastor was going to come over and talk with me. I thought, okay, kinda weird and out of the blue, but sure, I guess. And so I said I didn't care. My mom had been kind of distant the last few days and kept asking things like, "You know we love you, right?" and other stuff like that, but I was too sick to really think anything of it. Well, time rolls around and I'm in bed, and the preacher comes over and starts talking to me while I'm lying in bed. He asks how I'm doing, what it's been like being sick, and other just general stuff. He suddenly shifts to the work he's done as a preacher and how he's counseled lots of people in bad situations. He started talking about other young guys who were down and depressed or feeling ill or whatever. At first I thought, is this man about to start preaching to me about porn? I kinda chuckled at the thought internally, but he went a different route. He said that all these other guys had something in common, and it was that they played Dungeons and Dragons. He then started talking about how it was satanic and that the reason I'm so sick and depressed is because of demons that I've summoned myself through Dungeons and Dragons. He then asked me what I thought about all that, and I'll be honest, I don't remember exactly what I said and the conversation that went down afterwards from the emotions that would follow in a moment. I remember saying something like how I respect his opinion and all that, but he has never played it himself, nor has he seen me play or what we do in my groups, so I absolutely do not agree with him and never will. That is the best reaction one could possibly have if you're taking the firm approach. Don't insult them, but make it clear that you know what you're talking about and that you aren't buying it. I remember when I was a kid, I used to run D&D for some friends, and their parents totally bought into the satanic panic propaganda. In an attempt to fly under their radar, I simply called it Pathfinder. We were able to play and there were never any issues. That's when I learned that none of these adults know what they're talking about. My point is that these people don't hate D&D. They're on a useless crusade against what they made up about it. Unfortunately, talk and understanding won't work on this pastor. Roll post. We talked a bit more and I was starting to get a bad feeling when he said that he thinks I should talk to my dad. Me being sick and in bed and not really having a choice in the matter said fine, whatever, and he left. Now, the conversation that happened next is kind of hazy, but I'll recount the best I can. My dad comes in and immediately says that all of my D&D stuff is gone. Everything. He talked about he, the preacher, and some other men from my church had gone into my room 6 days prior, just after I had left the house to stay with my mom and my grandma. And they went inch by inch through my entire room and collected anything D&D or quote D&D themed. That meant any posters, books, or collectibles that they thought were D&D themed. So years of books from all throughout my life, manga, sketchbooks, memorabilia from my childhood, all of it they took. They then divided the loot between all of them and went to homes of church members in all different directions and threw it all away. My dad had waited to tell me to make sure that the garbage had come twice between when they dumped it and now, so that there was no chance I could go find it. He said that he's not sorry and he will never apologize for this. He also said he knew this wouldn't and won't stop me from doing D&D, but he did it to, quote, protect his family. He said don't ever bring stuff like that into the house anymore and that he isn't afraid to do this again. And that the reason I'm sick is my fault and that I'm possessed by demons that I summon through the game. I was in shock. I couldn't believe what I was hearing and I kind of zoned out. After he left, I got my cousin to take me by my house so I could go see it for myself. After going into my room and fully understanding what had actually happened, that what my dad told me had actually happened, I just kind of broke down. I found out later that no one else in my family knew, which was really just my mom and sister, supported this. My dad had even taken a set of dice that I had just bought a month ago and given to my sister because she had joined her first D&D campaign. My friends immediately wanted me to move out, but with my condition and having very little income, I could not. My mother told me that they had even asked an old friend of mine, who had once upon a time played D&D with me but has since moved on and we don't speak. They asked him what he thought about D&D, and he told them that from his experience there was nothing to be afraid or worried about with D&D or my group. And he's a missionary. This is probably the most infuriating part of the entire story. Let me explain. He actually went so far as to ask someone who would know about the potential dangers of D&D. He heard that it's nothing to be afraid of, and he still went on a rage fueled by the dying thermal energy of his last brain cell fizzling out. This behavior doesn't tell me he was looking for the truth. This tells me that he was seeking out justification for what he was already going to do. Like when somebody is endlessly scrolling Google, desperately searching for just one article that confirms what they want to believe. This makes a lot more sense when you consider that people are not purely logical and reasonable beings. In fact, a lot of the time, people choose what they want to be true and will use their logic to make themselves believe it. Anyways, the story's almost over, roll post. Needless to say that my relationship with my dad has never been the same. I decided to pretend that everything is alright so I don't get kicked out while I go through school to get a job. I have since patched things up with my mom, who hated that this happened and does not agree with it, but she believes that a Christian wife has to agree with the husband's decisions even if she doesn't like them. I also have a newfound respect for my sister, who, while they were throwing shit away, managed to save my favorite book series that I've read since the 4th grade, Aragon, if anyone's wondering. I still do D&D, and I have about 3 new sets of dice I've been gifted over the last year, but they stay with a friend whose house we do D&D at. Also, the sickness that I was having, and no one could figure it out, I just needed my gallbladder removed. Now I'm fine. Besides the bus injuries and depression, lol. If that was my dad, I would age twice as fast just so I can grow up and move out sooner. That said, I have many more RPG horror stories in these funny boxes to my side here. Till next time.